Hey everybody, today I want to talk to you about the fifth benthic region that we're going to study, the deep ocean. And when I say the deep ocean, what you may think of is deep sea angler fishes like in Finding Nemo's with the lantern on them and glowing stuff. But we're talking about the bottom of the ocean. We're talking about organisms. When you think about those deep sea organisms, they live literally miles above the areas of the ocean that we're talking about right now. This is literally, in most cases, the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. Keep in mind, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about this area of the ocean. And we in fact, have only explored about 2% of this area of the ocean. So a lot of this information isn't really well known. It's sort of just pieced together. There are four different deep ocean environments that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about, in each one of those environments, how organisms are adapted to live, as well as what provides chemosynthesis in these environments. Three of them in particular: hydrothermal vents, cold seeps, and another environment called dead bodies. But let's get to it. First, the four types of environments. The first one that we're going to talk about is hydrothermal vents, black smokers. These are undersea hot springs, basically underwater volcanoes that pump out water at about 400 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt lead. How organisms survive to live here, we'll talk about in a second, but that's one of the environments. The next is the abyssal plain. You might remember this when in the first unit we talked about areas of the deep ocean basin. The abyssal plain is just a large, flat, deep area underneath the ocean bottom. Next, we'll talk about cold seeps, probably the newest ocean region that we've just discovered. Cold seeps are areas where chemicals, specifically methanes and sulfides, have literally oozed out of the ocean floor and settled in a low spot. And they have a lot of really weird characteristics. For instance, that water that's dense with all those chemicals that have oozed out make it kind of appear as though you have a water underwater, sort of like a goo lagoon in reality. In fact, the creators of SpongeBob SquarePants used cold seeps as one of the sources for the idea for Goo Lagoon, a bay of water underwater. And last, we're going to talk about dead bodies. And as the name would suggest, that means dead stuff on the ocean bottom itself. Any types of large marine mammals like whales or dolphins that settle on the ocean floor and get eaten by organisms as they settle. First, let's talk about the abyssal plain. If you look at the abyssal plain organisms, right, organisms here tend to be long and kind of that elongated body shape. We don't really know why. They tend to be mostly deposit feeders and scavengers. Deposit feeders and scavengers, not either or. There's very little predators down there, and that's because there's not a lot of organisms. So if you depend on finding another organism to actually make a meal out of, you're going to be out of luck. What you have is very, very little water movement, so you have lots of material just settling on the ocean bottom. And you have dead, rotting stuff floating down from the ocean top, which is where you get scavengers. Something you can't tell from just looking at this picture is something I'm going to show you right now. You might recognize this bug. This is a roly-poly, an isopod, a common bug, a pill bug that you find on the ocean surface. And this is the deep-sea version of that same isopod. That's a deep-sea isopod. It's about 10,000 times larger. This is a phenomenon known as deep sea gigantism, and it's seen with a lot of these abyssal plain organisms. The organisms down there tend to be a lot larger than we would expect. We don't really know why. Some theories say that maybe it's a lack of competition of food. Some theories say that because of the cold water, it slows down these organisms' metabolism. It allows them to grow really, really big. Some people say that it's because the organisms that they evolved from were very, very large, but we don't really know. What we do know is, deep sea gigantism is present, and there you go. There's an example of it. You'll notice that on the abyssal plain, I never mentioned anything about chemosynthesis, and that's because the areas on the abyssal plain that have chemosynthesis are considered to be different ecological areas. Three areas on the abyssal plain that have chemosynthesis are cold seeps, dead bodies, and hydrothermal vents. All three of these areas, even though they're on the abyssal plain, have chemosynthesis, and therefore they're considered to be their own unique areas. Hydrothermal vents chemosynthesis is supplied mostly by chemosynthetic bacteria that live inside these tube worms. Keep in mind, these bacteria and archaea, they're extremophiles. They can survive extremely hot temperatures, literally hot enough to melt lead. Also, these organisms tend to be very, very fast growing. In fact, giant tube worms are the largest and fastest growing invertebrates in the ocean. Why? Because hydrothermal vents are basically underwater volcanoes, and volcanoes can stop erupting at any time. So organisms that live in these environments are very, very short-lived, and they have to grow very, very fast to take full advantage of the source of chemosynthesis as they go along. As soon as that volcano stops erupting, it's going to stop pumping chemicals into the water, and the bacteria and archaea that live inside the plumes of these tube worms aren't going to have anything to eat, and they're going to die. Cold seeps also have chemosynthesis, only in cold seeps, the chemosynthesis comes from mussels that live right up against that deep sea cold seep. Again, in that cold seep, you have a large, briny, dense kind of mixture of chemicals and methane and sulfates, and that's what the bacteria that now lives inside of these mussels is going to remove from the water in order to use for chemosynthesis. Now, interestingly enough, even though it's the same types of archaea and bacteria that live down inside these mussels and cold seeps, these organisms tend to be a lot slower growing than their relatives in hydrothermal vents. This isn't only because of the temperature. Marine scientists believe that their slower growing is an indicative of the fact that cold seeps are a lot longer lived than hydrothermal vents. That unlike hydrothermal vents, which really could be there one day and gone the next, cold seeps are much more stable environments. So these organisms don't have to be adapted to actually live for long periods of time. Even though both areas have chemosynthesis, even though both areas chemosynthesis is supplied by archaea and bacteria that live mutualistically with organisms, tube worms in the case of hydrothermal vents, deep sea mussels in the case of cold seeps. The big difference between hydrothermal vents and cold seeps is how long they're going to be around. Hydrothermal vents are temporary, cold seeps are more permanent, which creates a faster growing organism on a hydrothermal vent and a very slow growing organism on a cold seep. Last, we have dead bodies, dead rotting material that floats down to the ocean bottom. No surprise, most of the organisms you find on dead bodies are scavengers. These organisms that float down to the ocean bottom tend to be the largest organisms on Earth, whales and dolphins and porpoises, and that's no accident. In order to actually float down, it takes about 6-7 years, and those organisms or corpses are going to be consumed as they sink by every organism that they meet on their 7-mile journey down to the bottom of the ocean. As a result, only the largest organisms are the ones that actually make it down there in any meaningful way where there's enough meat to be consumed. These areas actually have chemosynthesis as well. The chemosynthesis in these areas are actually a chemosynthetic bacteria that forms on the whale bones themselves. It literally sucks nutrients, chemicals, out from the rotting whale bones and uses them, processes them into energy. This is called whale fall bacteria. It uses the chemicals released by whale bones to chemosynthesize with. What's interesting is that in the earlier 2000s, whale fall bacteria was actually harvested and processed, and the enzymes that whale fall bacteria uses to break down whale bones in such a cold, kind of dark environment were isolated. And they were applied into what is now known as Tide cold water detergent. The same way that the same enzyme that Tide cold water detergent uses to break down grease stains on your clothes in cold water are the same enzymes that whale fall bacteria uses to break down whale bones in a cold water environment. Another interesting thing about dead bodies is how they relate, or at least marine scientists believe they relate, to hydrothermal vents. Marine scientists believe that because hydrothermal vents are so short-lived, that what organisms do when a hydrothermal vent burns out is they go into hibernation in dead bodies. And those organisms hop from dead body to dead body to dead body to dead body over and over and over again until the next hydrothermal vent pops up. And this explains how you can have such a fast population of hydrothermal vents when a hydrothermal vent pops up, and how one can go out one day and not and all of a sudden all those organisms don't suddenly go extinct. Dead bodies, marine scientists believe, are actually stepping stones for hydrothermal vent organisms, wait stations, basically hotel stations for hydrothermal vent organisms. This is actually really important if you think about in terms of whale extinction. I mean, whale extinctions are well and good. We don't want it to happen because of biodiversity and a bunch of other great things. But the reality is that if whales go extinct, and this theory is true, that could actually really disrupt not just one, but two of the major deep sea ecosystems on Earth. Not only whale falls or dead bodies, but also hydrothermal vents. So you can make an argument that half of the deep sea ecology is resting on the fact that there are whales to actually get down there when they die. So that's it. We talked about the 4 deep ocean communities. We talked about dead bodies, hydrothermal vents, the abyssal plain, and dead bodies, hydrothermal vents, abyssal plains, and cold seeps. I got it. We talked about how the organisms are adapted to live in each one of these communities. We talked about how they're scavengers and deposit feeders in the abyssal plain, how chemosynthesis is supplied by chemosynthetic bacteria that live in tube worms and hydrothermal vents, that live in mussels and cold seeps, and whale fall bacteria and scavengers on dead bodies. And like I just said, we talked about how the sources of chemosynthesis in hydrothermal vents, cold seeps, and dead bodies, which would be tube worms, mussels, and whale fall bacteria in all 3. Then we talked about kind of how these ecosystems relate to each other. The fact that tube worms or other deep sea hydrothermal vent communities might use whale falls in order as stepping stones to get to the next hydrothermal vent, and how tube worms and hydrothermal vents are closely related to cold seeps. It's just that the organisms on tube worms are much shorter lived than the organisms on cold seeps. Stay tuned for the next lesson. It's going to be on ice. Not really a benthic environment, but remember, we're actually going to stick it in here because it's the best place that we're going to fit it. It does have a benthic region, but we're also going to use the opportunity to talk about cold weather organisms as well. So I hope you listen. Thanks.